The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Westminster as Inspector Thomas Hartwell clutched the leather document that would change everything. His hands trembled, not from the cold October air, but from the weight of what he held. An arrest warrant bearing the official seal of the Crown Prosecution Service. The name written in bold letters made his stomach churn. Charles Philip Arthur George Windsor, King of the United Kingdom. Thomas had served the Metropolitan Police for 23 years. He had arrested drug dealers in dark alleys, confronted armed robbers, and faced down violent criminals without flinching. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. The warrant stemmed from a corruption investigation that had been quietly building for months, involving offshore accounts and questionable financial dealings that allegedly dated back to Charles's time as Prince of Wales. The evidence had been mounting steadily. Swiss bank records showed suspicious transactions. Former royal staff members had come forward with damaging testimony. Financial experts had traced money through a maze of shell companies. The Crown Prosecution Service had no choice but to act, even though the target wore the crown itself. Thomas stood outside Buckingham Palace watching the early morning shift change. The guards moved with their usual precision, their red uniforms pristine, their faces emotionless. Behind those palace walls lived the man he was ordered to arrest. The irony wasn't lost on him that he served the crown, yet now the crown itself was his target. His radio crackled to life. "Inspector Hartwell, this is command. Are you in position?" The voice was tense, reflecting the historic nature of the operation. "In position," Thomas replied, his voice steadier than he felt, awaiting final authorization. The investigation had begun 18 months earlier when a whistleblower leaked documents to investigative journalists. The papers revealed a complex network of financial arrangements that raised serious questions about tax evasion and money laundering. What started as tabloid speculation had evolved into a serious criminal investigation when forensic accountants confirmed the authenticity of the documents. Public opinion had shifted dramatically as more details emerged. Protest groups gathered outside royal residences. Members of Parliament called for transparency. Even some Commonwealth nations expressed concern about the allegations. The monarchy, already under pressure from various scandals, found itself facing its greatest constitutional crisis in modern history. Thomas remembered the briefing from the previous evening. Chief Inspector Morrison had been clear about the procedure. They would approach through the main entrance, present the warrant to the palace officials, and request that His Majesty surrender himself for questioning. The legal system made no exceptions even for royalty. As he approached the palace gates, Thomas noticed the unusual number of media vans parked along the mall. Word had somehow leaked about the impending arrest, though the police had tried to keep the operation secret. Camera crews were setting up equipment while reporters spoke urgently into their phones. The whole world would be watching what happened next. The guard at the gate recognized Thomas's police identification and waved him through. Palace security had been notified of his arrival, though they weren't told the specific nature of his business. As Thomas walked across the forecourt, his footsteps echoed against the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Inside the palace, protocol officers scrambled to understand the situation. Never before had a reigning British monarch faced arrest. Legal experts had been consulted, constitutional scholars had been awakened in the middle of the night, and government ministers had held emergency meetings. The question everyone asked was simple yet profound. Could the king actually be arrested? The answer, according to legal precedent, was yes. The principle that no one was above the law applied even to the sovereign. However, the practical implications were staggering. What would happen to the monarchy? How would the government function? What about the Commonwealth realms that recognized Charles as their head of state? Thomas was escorted through corridors, lined with priceless artwork and photographs of previous monarchs. Each portrait seemed to watch him with disapproval, as if questioning his audacity to challenge royal authority. The weight of history pressed down on him with every step. He was led to a formal reception room where palace officials waited with barely concealed anxiety. The private secretary to the king, Sir Clive Alderton, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of professional composure despite the unprecedented circumstances. "Inspector Hartwell," Sir Clive began, his voice carefully, controlled. "I understand you have official business with His Majesty. Perhaps you could explain the nature of your visit." Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew the arrest warrant. The room fell silent as he unfolded the document. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Charles Philip Arthur George Windsor on charges of tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud. I need to speak with His Majesty immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Palace staff exchanged glances of disbelief. Sir Clive's composure finally cracked, his face paling as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. That moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in British history. Outside the palace walls, news of the arrest warrant was already spreading across social media. The hashtag #ArrestTheKing began trending worldwide within minutes. Television networks interrupted regular programming with breaking news bulletins. The British pound started falling against major currencies as investors reacted to the unprecedented political crisis. Thomas stood firm, waiting for a response. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law without fear or favor. Today, that oath would be tested like never before. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of one man, but the future of the British monarchy itself. Sir Clive Alderton's hands shook as he reached for his phone. The arrest warrant lay on the mahogany table between them like a ticking bomb. Inspector Hartwell watched as the private secretary dialed a number he had never hoped to use in such circumstances, Your Majesty. Sir Clive spoke into the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. A police inspector is here with legal documents." Charles was in his private study, reviewing correspondence about upcoming state visits. The call from his private secretary interrupted his morning routine. Something in Sir Clive's tone made the king set down his pen and listen carefully. "What kind of legal documents?" Charles asked, though a growing dread in his stomach suggested he already knew. "An arrest warrant, Your Majesty. The inspector is requesting your immediate presence." The phone line went silent for several long seconds. Charles stared out the window of his study, watching gardeners tend to the palace grounds as they had for generations. Everything looked normal, yet nothing would ever be the same again. The investigation that led to this moment had been thorough and devastating. Forensic accountants had traced millions of pounds through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The money had been moved through a network of companies with innocent-sounding names like Heritage Holdings and Crown Investments Limited. The trail began with the Duchy of Cornwall, the private estate that had provided Charles with income during his decades as Prince of Wales. Investigators discovered that legitimate estate income had been mixed with questionable payments from foreign governments and wealthy individuals seeking royal favor. The scheme was sophisticated, involving false invoices, phantom consulting fees, and carefully timed donations to royal charities that somehow found their way back into personal accounts. Thomas Hartwell waited in the reception room, aware that palace staff were watching his every move. Some looked at him with barely concealed hostility, viewing him as a traitor to the crown he served. Others seemed curious, perhaps wondering if this moment marked the beginning of the end for the monarchy. They had devoted their lives to serving. The media circus outside was growing by the hour. Helicopter news crews circled overhead, while reporters from around the world set up broadcast positions along the mall. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from shock to satisfaction. Republican groups celebrated while monarchist organizations expressed outrage and disbelief. Parliamentary leaders were hastily called back to London from their constituencies. The Prime Minister convened an emergency cabinet meeting to discuss the constitutional implications. Legal scholars debated whether a reigning monarch could actually be prosecuted, while historians searched for precedents in British law. Charles finally appeared in the reception room 20 minutes later, accompanied by his personal protection, officers, and legal counsel. He wore a dark suit and carried himself with the dignity expected of a king, but those who knew him well could see the strain in his eyes. Inspector Hartwell stood as the king entered. The moment felt surreal. A police officer preparing to arrest the man whose image appeared on currency and whose portrait hung in courtrooms across the nation. The very system of justice that gave Thomas his authority derived from the crown he was now challenging. "Your Majesty," Thomas began, his voice formal but respectful. "I am Inspector Thomas Hartwell of the Metropolitan Police. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." The words hung in the air like a challenge to centuries of royal tradition. Charles listened without expression, his training in public appearances serving him well in this most private of crises. Behind him, palace staff struggled to process what they were witnessing. "I understand the charges, Inspector," Charles replied quietly. "However, I must consult with my legal advisors about the proper procedure in such circumstances. As you might imagine, this is somewhat unprecedented." The king's solicitor, Margaret Thornton, stepped forward. She was one of London's most respected criminal lawyers, hastily summoned to the palace when news of the investigation first broke. "Inspector, we would like to request a brief postponement to address certain constitutional questions. The arrest of a reigning monarch raises complex legal issues that require careful consideration." Thomas had been briefed about potential delays and constitutional challenges. His superiors had made it clear that the law applied equally to all citizens, regardless of their status or title. However, they had also acknowledged that arresting the king would involve unprecedented procedural questions. "I understand your concerns," Thomas replied. "However, the warrant is clear and legally binding. I am prepared to allow reasonable time for legal consultation, but His Majesty will need to accompany me for questioning today." The standoff continued as lawyers whispered urgently to their client. Palace officials made phone calls to government ministers and constitutional experts. The weight of history pressed down on everyone in the room as they grappled with a situation that had never been contemplated by the architects of the British legal system. Outside, the crowd of media and onlookers continued to grow. Police barriers were erected to control the crowds as curious citizens came to witness history in the making. Some held signs supporting the king, while others demanded justice regardless of royal status. The investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting that Charles had used his position to solicit payments from foreign nationals seeking British honors or business advantages. Bank records showed mysterious payments coinciding with controversial knighthoods and favorable trade agreements. The paper trail was complex but damning, painting a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. As the legal discussions continued, Charles found himself reflecting on the irony of his situation. He had spent his entire life preparing to be king, only to face potential imprisonment within years of ascending to the throne. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than in this moment. Margaret Thornton finally addressed the inspector, after an hour of consultation. "Inspector Hartwell, His Majesty is prepared to cooperate with your investigation. However, we must insist on certain protocols given the unique constitutional position involved. We propose that any questioning take place here at the palace under appropriate security arrangements." Thomas shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The warrant requires His Majesty to be taken into custody for questioning at a designated police facility. I cannot make exceptions to standard procedure." The room fell silent again, as the reality of the situation sank in. For the first time, in over 1,000 years of British history, a reigning monarch would be arrested and taken to a police station like any other citizen accused of a crime. The foundations of the monarchy trembled under the weight of this unprecedented moment. The black police vehicle waited in the palace courtyard like a hearse at a funeral. Inspector Hartwell had requested an unmarked car to minimize the spectacle, but even the most discreet police transport looked ominous against the backdrop of Buckingham Palace. Charles walked slowly toward the vehicle, each step watched by millions around the world through live television coverage. His protection officers flanked him, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were powerless to prevent what was happening. For the first time in their careers, they could not protect their principal from the very system they had sworn to serve. The media frenzy had reached fever pitch. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures while photographers with long lenses captured every moment from behind police barriers. The images would be front-page news in every country where Charles served as head of state, potentially triggering constitutional crises across the Commonwealth. Margaret Thornton walked beside her client, briefing him on what to expect at the police station. "Your Majesty, they will likely hold you for up to 24 hours for questioning. We have the right to be present during all interviews. Remember, you are not obligated to answer any questions without legal counsel present." The investigation that brought them to this point had been methodical and devastating. Financial records showed that Charles had received over £30 million in questionable payments during his time as Prince of Wales. The money had flowed through a network of shell companies registered in tax havens, carefully disguised, to avoid detection by British tax authorities. The most damaging evidence came from recorded phone conversations between Charles and foreign business leaders. In one particularly incriminating call, the then prince could be heard discussing favorable treatment for a Saudi businessman's investment projects in exchange for substantial donations to royal charities. The businessman had later received an honorary knighthood, despite having no apparent qualifications for the honor. As Charles approached the police car, he paused and turned to face the palace one final time. The building had been his home, his office, and the symbol of everything he represented. Now it felt like a monument to a life that was crumbling around him. The irony was not lost on him that he might never return as a free man. Inspector Hartwell opened the car door and waited respectfully. Despite the circumstances, he maintained the courtesy due to any member of the public, regardless of their status. "Your Majesty, please watch your head as you enter the vehicle. The 5-mile journey from Buckingham Palace to Paddington Green Police Station normally took 15 minutes. Today, with security cordons and media helicopters, it would take nearly an hour." The route had been carefully planned to avoid the heaviest crowds, but thousands of people lined the streets to witness the historic moment. Inside the police car, Charles sat in silence, staring out the tinted windows at the crowds. Some people cheered and waved, apparently unaware of the circumstances. Others held signs calling for justice and an end to royal privilege. The divided reaction reflected a nation struggling to process the unprecedented events unfolding before them. The investigation had revealed that the corruption scheme involved several trusted members of the royal household. Charles's former private secretary had already been arrested and charged with conspiracy and money laundering. The man who had served the royal family for over 2 decades was now cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Bank records showed payments to royal staff members who had helped facilitate the illegal transactions. Gardeners at royal estates were paid bonuses for allowing their names to be used on false invoices. Stable hands found themselves listed as consultants on multi-million-pound development projects they had never heard of. The scheme was so widespread that investigators were still discovering new participants months after the initial arrests. Margaret Thornton received constant updates on her phone as the car made its way through London. Parliamentary leaders were calling for emergency sessions. The Archbishop of Canterbury had issued a statement expressing concern for the king and the institution of monarchy. Commonwealth nations were consulting their own constitutional experts about the implications for their relationship with the British Crown. "Your Majesty," the solicitor said quietly, "I should inform you that several Commonwealth nations are already discussing the possibility of becoming republics if these charges proceed to trial. The political implications are enormous." Charles nodded gravely. He had always known that his actions could affect more than just his own life. The monarchy he had inherited from his mother was a fragile institution, dependent on public trust and respect. Every scandal weakened its foundation, and this might be the blow that finally brought it down. The car passed through areas of London where Charles had conducted royal visits over the decades. He remembered opening hospitals, visiting schools, and meeting with community leaders. Those events had seemed meaningful at the time, but now they felt hollow in light of the corruption allegations. How many of those public appearances had been funded by money obtained through illegal means? Social media reactions were swift and brutal. The hashtag, or Criminal King, trended worldwide within hours. Memes appeared showing Charles in prison stripes. Republic campaigners organized protests demanding the immediate abolition of the monarchy. Even some traditional monarchist supporters expressed disappointment and called for Charles to abdicate in favor of his son William. The police car finally arrived at Paddington Green Police Station, a fortress-like building designed for high-security prisoners. The facility had previously housed terrorists and other dangerous criminals. Now it would hold a king. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present as Charles stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the entrance. Inspector Hartwell led the way into the station, followed by Charles and his legal team. Inside, the custody sergeant waited with the paperwork that would formally process the king like any other arrestee. The man who had signed laws and appointed prime ministers would now have his fingerprints taken and his photograph captured for a police database. The booking process was surreal in its mundane efficiency. Charles was asked to empty his pockets, remove his watch and wedding ring, and confirm his personal details. When asked for his occupation, he paused momentarily before quietly answering, "Head of State." The custody officer typed the response, without reaction, as if arresting monarchs was part of his daily routine. As the cell door closed behind him, Charles found himself in a small, windowless room with a single bed and basic facilities. The contrast with his usual accommodations could not have been starker. He sat on the narrow bed and closed his eyes, wondering if this was how his reign would be remembered, not for his environmental activism or charitable work, but for the criminal charges that brought him to this police cell. Outside the station, crowds continued to gather as news of the arrest spread around the world. The British pound continued to fall as international markets reacted to the political uncertainty. Currency traders worked through the night, trying to predict the economic impact of a constitutional crisis that had no historical precedent to guide them. The interview room at Paddington Green Police Station had witnessed countless interrogations of criminals, terrorists, and suspects of every description. Never before had it hosted a reigning monarch. Charles sat across from Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Morrison, his legal team flanking him on either side like bodyguards protecting their most valuable client. Detective Morrison had been chosen to lead the questioning because of her expertise in financial crimes and her reputation for treating all suspects with equal respect, regardless of their status. She had prosecuted corrupt politicians, fraudulent business leaders, and tax-avoiding celebrities. Today's subject was unprecedented, but her approach remained the same. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice professional and measured, "I need to ask you about a series of financial transactions that occurred between 2015 and 2023. Specifically, payments totaling £32 million that were deposited into accounts associated with your private estate." The evidence against Charles was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank statements showed regular transfers from foreign accounts into companies controlled by the royal household. Shell corporations with names like Windsor Holdings and Duchy Enterprises had received payments from Saudi businessmen, Russian oligarchs, and wealthy Americans seeking access to the British establishment. Margaret Thornton leaned forward. "Detective Morrison, my client maintains his innocence of all charges. Any financial arrangements were conducted in accordance with legal advice and established protocols for royal finances." The detective opened a thick file containing hundreds of documents. Each page represented months of investigation by forensic accountants and international law enforcement agencies. Swiss banking authorities had cooperated with the investigation, providing records that traced the money through multiple jurisdictions designed to hide its origin and destination. "Let me show you this document," Detective Morrison said, sliding a bank statement across the table. "This shows a payment of £5 million from Prince Khalid Al Rahman in March 2018. 3 weeks later, Prince Khalid received planning permission for a controversial development project in London that had previously been rejected. Can you explain this timing?" Charles studied the document carefully. His memory of specific transactions was hazy, complicated by the fact that many financial decisions had been handled by trusted advisors who were now under investigation themselves. The web of corruption was so complex that even he struggled to understand how all the pieces fit together. The most damaging evidence concerned Charles's relationship with a network of fixers and influence peddlers who had promised foreign clients access to the highest levels of British society. These middlemen had charged enormous fees for arranging meetings with royal family members, securing honors and titles, and facilitating business relationships with government officials. One particularly devastating piece of evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Charles and Viktor Petrov, a Russian businessman seeking to invest in British property despite international sanctions. The recording, made by intelligence services monitoring Petrov's communications, captured Charles discussing ways to circumvent legal restrictions in exchange for substantial payments to royal charities. "I want to play you this recording," Detective Morrison said, setting up a small digital player. This conversation took place on April 15, 2019. The other party is Viktor Petrov, who was under investigation for money laundering at the time. The room fell silent as Charles's voice filled the space, discussing financial arrangements that sounded increasingly criminal in the sterile environment of the police station. His lawyers had heard the recording before, but it was no less damaging on repeated listening. The casual way Charles discussed circumventing sanctions and hiding payments revealed a man who had become comfortable with illegal activities. Margaret Thornton requested a break to confer with her client. They moved to a small consultation room, where Charles could speak freely without being recorded. The solicitor's expression was grave as she outlined the strength of the prosecution's case. "Your Majesty, I must be frank with you. The evidence is substantial and well documented. The recordings are particularly damaging because they show intent and knowledge of wrongdoing. We need to consider our options carefully." The investigation had also uncovered evidence of tax evasion on an enormous scale. Charles had failed to declare millions of pounds in foreign income to British tax authorities, instead hiding the money in offshore accounts and using complex financial instruments to avoid detection. The unpaid taxes, including penalties and interest, totaled over £15 million. News of the questioning leaked to the media within hours. Television networks provided minute-by-minute coverage of the police station, with expert commentators analyzing every development. Former police officers explained the interview process while constitutional lawyers debated the unprecedented legal questions raised by prosecuting a monarch. International reaction was swift and varied. Commonwealth nations began emergency consultations about their constitutional relationship with Britain. Australia's Prime Minister called for calm while privately instructing advisors to prepare legislation for a Republican referendum. Canada's Parliament debated whether to remove Charles as head of state even before any trial concluded. The European Union expressed concern about political stability in Britain, already fragile after years of economic uncertainty. Currency markets continued to plunge as investors fled British assets. The pound reached its lowest level against the dollar in decades, prompting emergency intervention by the Bank of England. Back in the interview room, Detective Morrison continued her methodical questioning. Each question was supported by documents, recordings, or witness statements that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. The evidence suggested that Charles had viewed his position as a commercial opportunity rather than a public trust. "Your Majesty, I'm now going to ask you about honors and titles that were awarded to individuals who made substantial payments to your organizations. Let's start with the knighthood awarded to Ahmad Hassan in June 2020. The Hassan case was particularly egregious. The Lebanese businessman had paid £10 million to a royal charity just months before receiving his knighthood, despite having no apparent qualifications for the honor. Hassan was already under investigation in multiple countries for arms, dealing, and money laundering when he received his British honors. Charles's response was increasingly hesitant as the questioning continued. His legal team objected frequently, claiming that many questions exceeded the scope of the charges. However, Detective Morrison methodically linked each transaction to specific violations of tax law, money laundering regulations, and fraud statutes. The psychological pressure was enormous. Charles had spent his entire life in positions of authority and respect. The role reversal of being questioned like a common criminal was deeply unsettling. He began to understand how his actions had corrupted not just his own position, but the entire institution of monarchy. As the first day of questioning concluded, Charles was returned to his cell to await the next session. His lawyers worked through the night, reviewing evidence and preparing responses to the mounting allegations. Outside protests continued as the nation grappled with the unprecedented crisis facing the institution that had provided stability for over 1,000 years. The 5 words that would echo through history were still unspoken, waiting in the wings of a drama that was reshaping British society and challenging the very foundations of constitutional monarchy. The guard who would speak those words was still on duty, unaware that his simple response would capture the mood of a nation and define a moment that would be remembered for generations. The second day of questioning began at 9 in the morning sharp. Charles looked tired and strained as he was led back to the interview room. The weight of the previous day's revelations had clearly taken its toll. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he took his seat across from Detective Morrison. Margaret Thornton had spent the night reviewing the prosecution's evidence with a team of senior barristers. The case against her client was stronger than she had initially hoped, but she was still determined to mount a vigorous defense. Too much was at stake, not just for Charles personally, but for the institution of monarchy and the stability of the British state. Your Majesty, Detective Morrison began, today I want to focus on the period between 2020 and 2023, when the payments to your accounts increased significantly. Our investigation shows that during this time, you personally solicited donations from foreign nationals in exchange for access and influence. The evidence for this period was particularly damning because it was more recent and better documented. Modern banking systems left detailed digital trails that were nearly impossible to hide or explain away. Phone records, email communications, and travel logs created a comprehensive picture of Charles's activities during his final years as heir to the throne. One of the most shocking revelations concerned Charles's relationship with a Chinese businessman named Li Wei-chen. Chen had paid £20 million into royal accounts over 3 years while seeking British government approval for a controversial nuclear power project. The money was disguised as payments for cultural consultancy services that were never actually provided. Detective Morrison played a series of phone recordings that captured Charles discussing the nuclear project with Chen. In one particularly damaging conversation, Charles promised to speak with government ministers about expediting the approval process. The project was approved just weeks later, despite serious concerns raised by security services about Chen's links to Chinese intelligence. Your Majesty, in this conversation from September 2021, you clearly promise Mr. Chen that you will use your influence to support his nuclear project. How do you explain this in light of the substantial payments he made to your accounts? Charles's lawyers had prepared him for these questions, but the reality of hearing his own voice making what sounded like corrupt bargains was deeply uncomfortable. He had convinced himself at the time that he was simply facilitating legitimate business relationships, but the recordings stripped away any possibility of innocent interpretation. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that Charles had used royal tours and state visits as opportunities to solicit payments from foreign governments and wealthy individuals. During a 2022 visit to the Middle East, he had met privately with several businessmen who subsequently made substantial donations to royal charities. Bank records showed that much of this money was later transferred to personal accounts controlled by Charles. Margaret Thornton attempted to challenge the evidence at every turn. Detective Morrison, my client's activities were consistent with long-standing traditions of royal fundraising for charitable causes. The fact that some of these funds were used for legitimate royal expenses does not constitute criminal behavior. The detective was prepared for this line of defense. Ms. Thornton, our investigation shows that over 60% of the donated funds were used for personal expenses, including luxury travel, private entertainment, and property maintenance that had no charitable purpose whatsoever. This represents clear fraud and tax evasion. The most devastating evidence came from Charles's former private secretary, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. Sir Michael Reeves had worked for the royal household for over 20 years and had intimate knowledge of the financial arrangements. His testimony provided prosecutors with insider details that would have been impossible to obtain otherwise. Sir Michael had kept detailed records of meetings, phone calls, and financial transactions that he believed might one day be needed to protect himself legally. His files contained copies of agreements that explicitly linked payments to specific favors, making it impossible for Charles to claim ignorance of the corrupt arrangements. During a lunch break, Margaret Thornton met with Charles in the consultation room to discuss their increasingly desperate situation. The evidence was overwhelming, and she knew that fighting the charges in court would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence for her client. "Your Majesty, I believe we need to consider the possibility of a plea agreement. The prosecution has indicated they might be willing to discuss reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and restitution." The suggestion of pleading guilty was devastating for Charles. It would mean admitting to criminal behavior and accepting responsibility for actions that had damaged the monarchy beyond repair. However, the alternative of a lengthy trial and potential decades in prison was even worse. Outside the police station, the crowds had grown larger and more vocal. Monarchist supporters held vigils praying for Charles's release, while Republican campaigners celebrated what they saw as the end of an outdated institution. Police struggled to maintain order as the two groups increasingly confronted each other. The political implications were enormous. Parliament was in emergency session, debating whether to strip Charles of his royal titles and remove him from the line of succession. Some members called for the immediate abolition of the monarchy, while others argued for giving his son William a chance to restore the institution's reputation. International markets continued to react negatively to the uncertainty. The British pound fell to new lows while government borrowing costs increased as investors demanded higher returns to compensate for political risk. The Bank of England was forced to intervene in currency markets to prevent a complete collapse of confidence in British financial stability. Commonwealth nations were moving quickly to distance themselves from the crisis. New Zealand announced a referendum on becoming a republic within 6 months. Australia's parliament passed emergency legislation allowing for the removal of the British monarch as head of state, without requiring a constitutional amendment. Other Commonwealth realms were considering similar measures. As the afternoon questioning session continued, Detective Morrison focused on the tax evasion charges that would be easiest to prove in court. Charles had failed to declare over £40 million in foreign income over a 10-year period, hiding the money in a network of offshore accounts and shell companies designed to avoid detection by British tax authorities. The undeclared income included not just the corrupt payments, but also legitimate investment returns and business profits that Charles had simply chosen not to report. This pattern of systematic tax avoidance demonstrated a casual disregard for legal obligations that would be difficult to defend in court. "Your Majesty, these bank records show income of over £4 million per year that was never declared to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. The unpaid taxes, including penalties and interest, total over £18 million. How do you explain this systematic failure to meet your legal obligations?" Charles's response was increasingly incoherent as the weight of evidence mounted against him. His lawyers objected frequently, but their protests sounded increasingly desperate as prosecutors presented document after document proving their client's guilt. The questioning continued late into the evening as Detective Morrison methodically worked through the evidence. Each transaction was linked to specific criminal charges, building a case that would be virtually impossible to defend in court. By the end of the second day, everyone in the room understood that Charles's fate was sealed. As he was returned to his cell that night, Charles reflected on how his life had come to this point. The greed and arrogance that had led him to abuse his position now threatened to destroy not just his own life, but the institution he had been born to serve. The 5 words that would define this moment in history were waiting to be spoken, though Charles did not yet know that his fate would ultimately be sealed by the simple honesty of a palace guard. 3 months after Charles's arrest, the trial that would determine the fate of the British monarchy began at the Old Bailey. The courthouse was surrounded by barriers and armed police as protesters from both sides gathered in unprecedented numbers. Inside, the world's media filled every available seat to witness what many called the trial of the century. Charles entered the dock wearing a simple dark suit, looking older and more frail than when he had been arrested. The months of legal proceedings, public humiliation, and family discord had taken their toll. His children had publicly distanced themselves from him, while Camilla had retreated to private life, refusing all public appearances. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Lead prosecutor Sir James Whitfield methodically outlined the evidence of corruption, tax evasion, and fraud that spanned nearly a decade. Bank records, recordings, and witness testimony painted a picture of a man who had systematically abused his position for personal gain. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with each day bringing new revelations about the extent of Charles's criminal activities. Former palace staff testified about suspicious meetings and unusual financial arrangements. International banking experts explained how money had been laundered through complex networks of offshore companies. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The most dramatic moment came when Sir Michael Reeves, Charles's former private secretary, took the witness stand. His testimony was devastating, providing insider details about how the corruption scheme had operated. He described meetings where Charles personally negotiated payments in exchange for honors and access, showing a level of direct involvement that made claims of ignorance impossible to maintain. Margaret Thornton's defense strategy focused on portraying Charles as a man who had been poorly advised by corrupt staff members. She argued that the former king had trusted others to handle his financial affairs and was unaware of the illegal activities being conducted in his name. However, the recorded phone conversations made this defense untenable. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. The foreman stood slowly, the weight of history evident in his deliberate movements. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of tax evasion, we find the defendant guilty. Charles showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, though those who knew him well could see the defeat in his eyes. The man who had been born to rule over millions of people was now a convicted criminal, facing the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Judge Sir Richard Hawthorne had the unprecedented task of sentencing a former monarch, balancing the severity of the crimes with the unique circumstances of the defendant. His remarks were measured but firm. Charles Windsor, you have been found guilty of serious criminal offenses that strike at the heart of public trust in our institutions. The fact that you held the highest office in the land makes your crimes even more serious, not less. You abused your position, betrayed the trust of the British people, and brought shame upon the monarchy itself. The sentence was 15 years, in prison, with a requirement to pay back over £50 million in stolen funds and unpaid taxes. Charles was immediately taken into custody, beginning a prison term that would likely last the rest of his life given his advanced age. But it was what happened next that would truly echo through history. As Charles was led from the courthouse in handcuffs, a reporter managed to break through the police cordon and shout a question that captured the attention of the world. "Do you have any message for the British people?" the reporter called out. Charles paused and looked back at the crowd of onlookers, media, and protesters. For a moment it seemed he might speak, might offer some final words of explanation or apology. But before he could respond, one of his police escorts stepped forward. Sergeant Robert Davies had been a palace guard for 12 years before joining the Metropolitan Police. He had protected the royal family during countless public appearances and had always maintained the traditional silence expected of his position. But in this moment, watching the man he had once served being led away in chains, something inside him broke. The reporter thrust his microphone toward the sergeant. "Officer, what's your reaction to seeing the former king arrested and convicted?" Sergeant Davies looked directly into the camera, his face showing a mixture of sadness and resolution. When he spoke, his words were simple but devastating in their honesty. They captured the mood of a nation that felt betrayed by someone they had been taught to respect and trust. "He brought this on himself," Sergeant Davies said quietly. Those 5 words spread around the world within minutes. They appeared on newspaper headlines, social media posts, and television broadcasts in dozens of languages. The simple honesty of a working police officer seemed to speak for millions of people who felt let down by the corruption and betrayal. 3-4 phrase became a rallying cry for those who supported the prosecution, and a symbol of the end of unquestioned deference to authority. He brought this on himself, appeared on protest signs, political speeches, and historical analyses of the constitutional crisis that followed Charles' conviction. In the months that followed, William was crowned King William III in a subdued ceremony that bore little resemblance to the grand coronations of the past. The new monarch pledged to restore trust in the institution and implement unprecedented transparency measures to prevent future corruption. However, public support for the monarchy remained at historic lows. Several Commonwealth nations formally became republics within a year of Charles's conviction. Australia, New Zealand, and Canada all voted to remove the British monarch as their head of state. The once mighty British Commonwealth was reduced to a handful of small nations that maintained their historical ties more out of tradition than genuine loyalty. Charles served 8 years of his sentence before dying in prison at the age of 83. His death was barely noted by the British media, a stark contrast to the wall-to-wall coverage that had once surrounded every aspect of royal life. He was buried in a simple ceremony attended only by immediate family members. The 5 words spoken by Sergeant Davies became part of British historical consciousness, taught in schools as an example of how simple honesty could capture complex truths. They represented the moment when centuries of deference to royal authority finally crumbled, replaced by a more democratic understanding that no one, regardless of birth or title, was above the law. Years later, historians would debate whether Charles's downfall was inevitable or whether different choices might have preserved the monarchy. But Sergeant Davies' words remained the most concise summary of the entire affair. In the end, the last king of the United Kingdom had indeed brought it all on himself, destroying not just his own life but the institution he was meant to protect and serve.